Thing that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. First hour, we're going to spend some time going through a book that I think you're going to find very helpful. The next hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. What does this drone strike that Ukraine had against Russia, what might that mean for our military? A very important Supreme Court decision that has come down that's going to affect you and maybe even the future of this country, and a variety of other topics that we will get into, including a comment or two about where higher education is going and how that might be affected by such things as YouTube and artificial intelligence. So lots to cover in the first hour, second hour, I should say. But in the first hour, we do want to focus some time on a topic we've addressed before. You might remember the book of The Great Dechurching, and we've talked about sometimes the exit from the church, exit interviews and things of that nature. We've talked about deconstruction with Lisa Childers, and also in the book by Sean McDowell and others. And so there is a real sense of disillusionment and even deconstruction that's taking place. So let's identify the problem, and then how can we find our way back? As our latest booklet that came out in May called False Spirituality got into, we have a lot of people that identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. They say, I'm really not interested in the church, really not even necessarily interested in the Bible or Jesus, but I do have these kind of spiritual needs. And that is, I think, an illustration that just because you walk away or never even went to church doesn't mean that you're finding that it's providing any kind of joy and satisfaction in this secular world. So I think you're going to find this to be a good conversation that we're going to have today with Nicholas McDonald. He is the author of this book, The Light in Our Eyes. It came out recently. It's published by our good friends at Multnomah. He's associate pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Central Illinois, an individual that has his degree from Gordon Conwell Seminary, studied creative writing and other things at Oxford University, also writes regularly for the Gospel Coalition. And Nicholas, welcome to Point of View.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin. I guess a lot of this is just your personal journey, and I think that would be helpful to at least put some of that on the table, because in some respects you can relate to some of the individuals you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So my personal journey is about growing up in the church, but really feeling somewhat disillusioned with the experience that I had. Part of my story is being part of a very large youth group when I was in high school, and I enjoyed it at the time, but it was also a time when what my youth pastor was teaching me is that Jesus wanted to take all of my dreams and all the things I wanted out of life, and he wanted to fulfill those dreams, which to a 16-year-old, that sounds great. That sounds like, great. I love that version of Jesus. But the problem was that as I started to encounter reality, that story didn't really map onto what I was reading in the Bible, and it didn't really map onto the experiences that I was having. So, for example, my senior year of high school, this same youth group went on a trip to South Africa, to a very small, impoverished village, where there were some non-Christians there, but also there were some Christian people there. And, they were very faithful, very hospitable, but they were also eating bone broth for dinner, and they were living in tin sheds. And the thought occurred to me, if God's plan for all of us is just to take everything I want and give it to me in life, then it seems like God must love me more than these people, because this isn't working out for them. And that can't be right. That can't be what Jesus is saying. That can't be the message of the Bible. 2 weeks after that, I returned home to my home in Brighton, Michigan, and I had probably the worst experience I think I'll probably ever have in life, which is finding my brother in our backyard pool. He had drowned. I tried to resuscitate him, was not able to. It was a really devastating time in life. And I thought, if Jesus just wants to fulfill all of my dreams, well, my life really feels like a nightmare. Yeah. And I don't feel like he's doing a good job. And so it was really that false version of the gospel that led me away from the church in the first place. And I left the church for several years in college.
Right. Well, and again, you do talk about that, the idea of God's dreams and Jesus' dreams are bigger and better. And I might just point out that near the end of the book, when we get to the third section, Jesus' dreams, love, freedom, and beauty, get us into some of that. But your experience is not atypical. Sadly, it's very typical of individuals who maybe were given maybe a false box top, or maybe I won't say a false gospel, but a false set of assumptions that were made about the Christian life. And because it didn't match up with your own experience, or, and I can hold up our booklet that we've done on abusive churches, maybe some have walked away from the church because they've seen hypocrisy, abuse, or whatever. In some respects, your book is an attempt to say, hey, I'm a fellow traveler. I really have struggled with some of these issues too, but this might provide you with a way back. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can relate to some of those experiences. One of the stories I tell in the book is sort of in my first foray back into the church after college. Unfortunately, we ended up in a really unhealthy, abusive church situation. And so when we talk about church abuse, it's very personal to me. And I don't go into much detail in the book because some of it is just stuff we're going to hold to ourselves. But really, my experience in this particular church was that, we were living in a pretty impoverished part of the city of Indianapolis, and I was working with maybe 70 or 80 high school and middle school students. And my goal was to share the gospel with them, but also to take care of their needs. They had clear needs, and I wanted to start some reading programs and things like that for them. And unfortunately, what I learned, and at the time I thought, I don't really care about theology. Theology doesn't matter. I'm gonna follow Jesus in this space. But what I learned was that the pastor of this church and I kept sort of having some tension because what he would say is, we don't really do things for the community. Our job is just to preach the gospel. And in some ways, I can still say as a minister, that's still my main job. But as I started to uncover some of the things that he was really teaching, I discovered, oh, wait a second. His version of the gospel is a very specific way of telling the story of the gospel that doesn't really align with the way that Jesus told the story of the gospel. And in fact, one particular Sunday, the pastor stood up and he announced that we were no longer allowed to teach from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the stories about Jesus' own life. And it just occurred to me at the time, I just wonder how the Apostle Paul would feel about this, 2,000 years later, walking in on the church and like, yeah, we've canceled Jesus now, so we've got it all taken care of. Yeah. And I realized at that time, actually, your theology matters, and theology makes a difference in the way you think about the world around you.
Of course.
And sometimes that bad theology can be harmful to the people around you. So those are real experiences for me.
We sometimes talk about a truncated gospel, but that's more truncated than we even are implying. Let me come back after the break because one of the things you said is you met C.S. Lewis, and certainly one of the things we talk about so often here in terms of worldview and apologetics is some of that, and that will get us into how to maybe reach out and to begin to diagnose what's going on in our culture and ourselves and how to find a way back. We'll be back after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about social media and the teen brain. Today, I'd like to talk about social media and the impact on teenagers' mental health. An article in Axios reminds the reader that experts have been increasingly warning of a connection between heavy social media use and mental health issues in children. Apparently, there are lawsuits against social media producers that accuse them of contributing to a youth mental health crisis. Now, one of the experts quoted is Jean Twenge, who I've quoted in previous commentaries. She is a psychology professor at San Diego State University and leading expert on the subject. Here are just a few of her findings. There is a substantial link to depression, and that link tends to be stronger among girls. The amount of time spent on social media also has an effect. The more time the teen, particularly a teen girl, spends using social media, the more likely it is that she will be depressed. Jean Twenge is probably best known for her book, iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy. She describes how digital technology has shaped Generation Z, which is why she calls them iGen. Social media harms teens in 4 ways. First, social comparison. Everyone else's life looks more glamorous online. Second, displacement, because teens spend too much time online instead of with family and friends. Third, algorithms prod them towards unhealthy content. Fourth is pornography, which is reaching kids at younger ages. These recent studies should concern parents and provide them with sufficient motivation to control their family's media input, and pastors and youth leaders should also take note and warn their congregation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about this book, The Light in Our Eyes. Nicholas McDonald with us, rediscovering the love, beauty, and freedom of Jesus in an age of disillusionment. And of course, you've shared some of the really powerful and tragic stories in your section on relevance. That leads, of course, to a section you talk about in terms of vacuum. At that point, you say you met C.S. Lewis during your last 2 semesters in college, and it does seem to me that before we get into your next section on restoration, there were, if you will, seeds or opportunities that provided some of that restoration. But I'll let you tell the story because, of course, you've lived it, and I'm just reading about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my journey is that feeling somewhat disillusioned with the American evangelical experience. I never really planned to step back into the church, but I did have the opportunity to study abroad during my last 2 semesters in college at the University of Oxford, as you mentioned. And my goal was to just study creative writing and literature, and my goal was to write children's literature. So the natural person to encounter through that process was C.S. Lewis, one of the founders of the modern children's literature movement. And so as I started to read some of his writings, it was obviously his love and his skill and giftedness in teaching and in literature and storytelling that was captivating. But I actually read his autobiography called Surprised by Joy.
Right.
And when I sat down with his story, I realized that the way he was thinking about Christianity was a bit different than the way I was thinking of Christianity growing up. For C.S. Lewis, he was a lover of medieval literature. He was a lover of the arts. And something he describes in that book that I'd never heard anyone put into words is it's a German word, Sehnsucht, which is it's sort of it's a longing, it's a yearning, it's a happy sadness. He describes feeling this for the first time when he read Wind in the Willows as a child, and just feeling like somehow Wind in the Willows described this world that he longed for, but he was shut out of it. He was locked out of it. Or when his brother Arnie brings him this little nature set as a child, and he just felt like, somehow this is communicating something to my heart, that I'm longing for, but I don't know what it is. And so as Lewis tried on the clothing of atheism, what he found was that his atheist worldview actually told him that this was a desire that he should forget about. There's nothing in this world transcendent. There was nothing meaningful. There was nothing truly beautiful. It was all an illusion. And so what he found was that his atheistic worldview, which he thought was going to be very liberating and freeing, was actually a trap. He was not able to follow those longings of his heart that Jesus had placed inside of him. And the landing place he found, Lewis calls himself the most reluctant convert ever. He's not planning on becoming a Christian, but really found that when he studied the life of Jesus and he spoke with his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien's sort of challenge to him was, hey, what if those longings are God's breadcrumbs to point you back to himself? And what if the quote-unquote myth about Jesus is actually a true myth? What if Jesus was the true myth? He was the true one who lived the life that you're longing for. He died a death that you deserve, and he rose from the dead. And you read about those kinds of stories in Norse mythology, and you love them. And yet when it comes to Jesus, somehow you don't like it. And Lewis was very convicted by that and sort of rattled by it. And it was pretty soon after that he himself converted to the Christian faith. And he told his story in such a way that I thought, oh, if that's what Christianity is about, if it's about fulfilling the deep, deep longings of our heart, not the shallow longings I had as a 16-year-old, but the deep longings of our heart, maybe there's something to it. And so I stepped back into church for the first time during those 2 semesters.
Well, again, that brings me to, of course, the C.S. Lewis quote, that very famous one, that if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is we were made for another world. And I found from an evangelistic, sometimes even apologetic point of view, that works pretty well, because there is this sense that there's more to life than life. Why would I desire beauty? Why would I demand people to be honest? Why would I hope that there would be some final justice, even in a world of injustice and pain and evil? And I think longing brings longing back maybe to the Garden of Eden, or to the future new heavens and new earth. And I think that's a powerful argument, which was so instrumental in your particular journey as well. So in your second section, you talk about this idea of restoration, and it talks about escape. Of course, you also use this song of Zechariah, or Zechariah's prayer, however you want to look at it. And I thought that was very unique in your particular writing. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the context I walked back into when I was in England was an Anglican church. In the Anglican church, many Anglicans consider themselves evangelical, but the word evangelical is used a bit differently in Europe than it is here in the States. And so walking into that church, I had a different sense of, the church that I belonged to in England had the sense that they belonged to the global historic church. They were just one small piece of the puzzle. And as strange as it may sound, as an American, I just thought it all started here, right? I just thought, hey, we started this. This is our thing.
Nope.
Well, of course, as an American, I would think that. But as I started to get interested in this idea of, maybe the story is much older than me. Maybe there's something bigger than maybe that very shallow presentation of Jesus I grew up in. I was introduced to a resource called the Book of Common Prayer, which I had never heard of in my life. But as I investigated this, I realized, Christians all around the world for centuries have been using this Book of Common Prayer to pray. And so I tried it on a little bit. But one of those surprising things I found in the Book of Common Prayer is that every single day, there's very few prayers that make it into the Book of Common Prayer every single day. The Lord's Prayer is one of them. But the other one is the Song of Zechariah. And as I read through this Song of Zechariah every single morning, I thought, this doesn't really map onto the categories of the gospel as I was taught it. And Zechariah seems to be speaking to the ways that Jesus does fulfill our deepest longings, and that Jesus, as you said earlier, Zechariah's vision is really not that we would escape earth to go to heaven, but that heaven would come down to earth, and that Jesus' kingdom would come. And so this was new to me, so this journey started then, but as I started unraveling Zechariah's song, I thought, well, this if this is the gospel, this is actually good news. This is good news. This is about redeeming everything and bringing restoration to everything that Jesus' hands touch. And so that was really my first foray into that story. And not only that, but as I read the actual story of Zechariah, I thought, well, I can relate to this guy. He, in some ways, he's disillusioned. And when the angel comes to him to promise John the Baptist his son is going to be born, he's skeptical. He's like, I don't know. I've lived quite a few decades, and I haven't really seen something like that happen. So prove it to me. And of course, the angel gives him some discipline for that. He's muted for a long period of time until John the Baptist is born. But as I began to think about that, I thought, oh well, he's being punished. But as I reflect in the book, I later thought, I don't think he's actually being punished. I think he's giving him an opportunity to reflect silently. Let's rethink what the beautiful gospel story is. And I don't think we ever get Zechariah's song if we don't have Zechariah's silence.
Right.
So that's a beautiful creative gift that we have today because of that.
And again, I agree with you. You see, of course, in the Old Testament, the idea, be still and know that I'm God. We talk about the fact that we should meditate on God's word. If you're out there talking all the time, and he was, if you will, in quotes, a minister, not exactly, but you know where I'm getting at here. That's one of the things you do all the time. You talk, I talk, we all talk. And to actually have a time of silence, I think that is significant. And so that is chapter 8 in the book. We're going to take a break. We'll come back and get into some others, shalom, as well as, of course, just Jesus' dreams, because in some respects, this is an attempt to maybe help some of you or people that you know, people that are in your family, people in your sphere of influence, friends, neighbors, coworkers, whatever it might be, who are disillusioned either by the church, American evangelicalism, disillusioned by religion in general. They fit into the category of our booklet that we just produced on spiritual but not religious, or even our booklet on the next generation saying, well, that was good for my parents, but it's not really good for me. This book might be a way to kind of follow the fellow journey, the spiritual journey of Nicholas McDonald, and to see that there is an opportunity to rediscover some of these very important principles. So we'll come back and get into that in a little bit more detail. If you'd like to know about the book, I suspect you can find it in your local bookstore. It's published by our friends at Multnomah. But the good news is we provide opportunities for you to get it on our website as well at pointofview.net. So let's take a break, and we will continue our spiritual pilgrimage. All that coming up right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about this new book, The Light in Our Eyes, Rediscovering the Love, Beauty, and Freedom of Jesus in an Age of Disillusionment. It is published by Multnomah. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about that on our website, as well as information about Nicholas McDonald, who is our guest. And Nicholas, before we get back to your book, it seems to me that there's another issue that you might be able to speak to better than some, and that is the fact that we sometimes in the evangelical world, especially in America, may not be necessarily true in England and other places, don't know what to do with the arts, don't know what to do with writing, film, and the rest. And of course, that's been your interest. I'm holding up our booklet by our producer, who, by the way, is right now in England. I think he's at Cambridge at the moment, but it's on imagination. And we wrote that, and we do really focus on Francis Schaeffer's book, Art in the Bible, and even C.S. Lewis's The Weight of Glory, and a variety of others, that it does seem to me that that's another reason that people that have maybe an artistic bent, they don't necessarily see beauty in the church. They have gifts that aren't necessarily affirmed in the church. And I think that's another issue that perhaps was instrumental in your life, and given your interest in film and writing, I'd love to hear your comments about that.
Yeah, you're inviting me onto a soapbox. I got to be careful now. So, yes. So, when you mention the arts and imagination, I think of, so several years ago, I was doing campus ministry at the University of Missouri, working with college students through a ministry called RUF.
Oh, sure.
And I'm thinking of one particular student. His name is Michael. And Michael was an artist. And one of the things that he felt from his particular youth group growing up was that there was only one thing Jesus was interested in, and that was bringing more people to youth group. Now, I love when Jesus brings people into his church, so don't hear what I'm not saying. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But the flip side of that was that as an artist who loved to paint, what was communicated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, was, well, that's not really kingdom work. It's not really what Jesus has asked you to be doing. So anytime you're painting, or anytime you're doing things like sports or using your sense of humor, these are all sort of ways of sidetracking you from what Jesus' mission for you is, which is really just growing our youth group. And so as we began to talk, I remember particularly where we were. We took a walk onto a larger building on campus, and we were sort of overlooking this beautiful fall landscape with red and orange and yellow tree leaves. And I looked around the beauty of the creation around us, and I said, Michael, Jesus created this. Do you think he enjoys it? And he said, well, probably. And I said, well, think about your painting. Do you enjoy the beauty that you create? And he said, well, yeah, I do. And as we had this conversation, what I began to realize when I asked him, okay, Michael, what do you think the gospel is? And he returned to this idea, well, Jesus wants to sort of get us out of this created world. I said, all right, here's the problem with that, Michael. If Jesus' plan is to help you to leave your body and creation, then I know this is going to sound strange, but that means Jesus doesn't love you. And he kind of looked at me like, well, I don't think a pastor should be able to say that. And I said, no, I'm serious about that. I really, and I was actually just repeating something the early church had said about the same sort of strand of thought in the early church, that Jesus was uninterested in our bodies. This is quoting a church father, Tertullian, who said, hey, if God does not love us in our bodies, and if he will not resurrect our bodies, and if he's not coming to restore all of creation, your God doesn't really love you. He just loves part of you. And so as I spoke with Michael, I just saw tears running down his eyes as I said, actually, I think the good news is better than what you've been told. I think that Jesus is here to reconcile you to himself through his life, death, and resurrection. But I think he's also here to reconcile all things to himself. That means Jesus is interested in bringing healing and renewal and beauty through your painting, through your sense of humor, through the things that you love. And I think the gospel is better than you thought it was. And so I think that presupposition that we have that Jesus is uninterested in creation is behind a lot of why we don't equip people very well to be great artists and to have a great sense of imagination and to use those things for God's glory.
Well said. Well, let's get into that because I think that's a natural lead into your chapter on shalom, but in particular on this idea of Sehnsucht, which is German for longing or desire or yearning or craving, because in some respects, once you begin to understand that, it's sort of happiness and sadness, you begin to talk about, for example, watching films. We'll just pick on Peter Jackson films for a minute and talking about bursting into to tears. And so in some respects, that same experience you are sharing with him is part of your own spiritual testimony, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so what you're referring to in the book is a chapter where I start talking about some of the ways that I see even today in our culture, people, and you mentioned this earlier, people are longing for a sense of the transcendent. They're longing for something other than what's right in front of them. And we just see that all over the place. So one of the books I read just last year was by a guy named Craig Foster. He created an award-winning documentary called My Octopus Teacher, and he later wrote a book about it. And I won't be able to quote him exactly now, but something he says is that, his life mission is to kind of go into these little tribal cultures around the world and investigate what they do, because his theory as an evolutionary scientist is, if we could get back to our primal roots, if we could go back to our barbaric roots, then we would be living a full, flourishing human life. And so he chased that rabbit over and over and over again. But it's so fascinating because in the book itself, he's recommending, here's all these ways that you can be more like your primal ancestors. And yet at the very beginning, he says, the greatest experiences I've had in these tribal cultures, having these wonderful experiences, they are thrilling, and yet somehow they evoke a sadness in me that I just don't understand.
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to say at the very beginning of your book, saying I'm going to lead you to a life of flourishing, is that you can't get over the Sehnsucht. You are looking for something transcendent, and your worldview doesn't provide that transcendent thing. And I believe that Jesus is the thing you're looking for.
Yes. Well, again, I'll look that up. My Octopus Teacher by Craig Foster. But that leads us into the last section, and I wanted to give time to each one of those because you talk about each one of what you call Jesus dreams. The first obvious one is love, and that is we need to really understand what love means, and that is, of course, one of those transcendent experiences that we have here on earth.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we hear about the word love, hopefully, in our churches. But something that really occurred to me again during my time with RUF, the campus ministry, is that I think to really understand Jesus' love, I need to understand that I am a sinner, and not just a hypothetical sinner, but an actual sinner.
Yes. So
one of the stories I tell is about being part of this smaller prayer group in RUF. It was one of my first years, and we're going around, and I'm hearing these other pastors, and they're talking about their actual sin. And they're saying, things like, I got into an argument with my wife last night. I'm having doubts about Jesus this month. And I thought, well, you can't say these things as a pastor. You're not allowed to think those things as a pastor. And at first I thought, you all are pretty bad pastors. So I don't know that I really want to be part of this organization.
Right.
But what I began to see, and one experience really made this hit home for me, is that I was on an elevator with one of our fellow campus ministers, and we were at this hotel, and there were some realtors having a conference at the same hotel. And so this very inebriated businessman stumbles into our elevator, and he's kind of out of control. And I was a little bit annoyed. I'm thinking, I don't want to talk to you. I just want to get to my room. And I'm on the elevator with my friend Chris, who had been in that prayer group, and he had shared all sorts of things. And he was looking at this man, and the man looked at us and said, "What's RUF?" But he said rough because that's a self-inflicted wound. But it annoyed me a little bit. But he started asking us questions, and I tried to brush him off, but my friend Chris just kept looking him in the eyes and giving him these very sincere, very pastoral answers to his questions. And sort of at the end of our elevator ride together, the drunken businessman said, well, I'm probably going to need to talk to a pastor at the end of this crazy week. And I ignored him, but my friend Chris just looked him in the eyes and said, you know what? We would love to talk to you. We would love to talk to you. And Chris left, and the realtor left.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. You would. Yeah. And so they both leave, and I'm standing in the elevator by myself, and I'm thinking, what just happened there is so convicting to me. I could not see myself in that man's struggles, and yet my friend Chris could. And what I realized is there was a connection there, because my friend Chris, he understood he was an actual sinner. And he regularly confessed his sin, and he knew that Jesus could see him in his struggles, and so that's why he was able to extend Jesus' hospitality to someone who's in a very different place than we were.
What a great story. We'll take a break, continue our conversation with Nicholas McDonald right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, spending just a few more minutes on the book, The Light in Our Eyes, Rediscovering the Love, Beauty, and Freedom of Jesus in an Age of Disillusionment. Nicholas McDonald with us. We've talked about in Jesus' dreams, love. We'll get into freedom and beauty. But Nicholas, I got to say, if nothing else, I appreciate a guy with a sense of humor because I've always enjoyed Nate Bargatze. And Nate Bargatze is the individual who plays George Washington in that well-known Saturday Night Live skit. But if nothing else, I love a little bit of humor in the midst of getting into that second principle, which is freedom, and the importance of understanding Jesus' prophetic ministry of freedom. So how is that helpful to individuals as well?
Yes, well, I love that skit, and I'm going to fail if I try to retell it here. But the Bargotsky George Washington skit is this great sort of skewering of this American idea of freedom, where you've got these Revolutionary War soldiers, and they're sitting around and talking about what are the things that America has been freed for? Well, we're going to have our own system of weights and measurements. Like, wait, really? That's what we're being liberated for? And there's just this sense of this peculiar sort of American myth, I think, and I think this is why it resonated with us, is that freedom means being able to do things however we want to do them, regardless of what people have done before, regardless of what people around the world do. We'll just do it our way, right? I mean, my last name's McDonald. Have it your way. That's the way we do it, right? And so, and that's one of the reasons I love that skit. And so what I try to do in this particular section of the book is actually, in one sense, say, I think that Jesus created you for freedom. So I think 10 years ago I might have said, oh, you want freedom? That's bad. I would actually say now, I think Jesus wants freedom for you. We see the word freedom. Jesus uses the word freedom. He says, if you believe the truth, you'll be set free, right?
That's right.
Paul in the book of Galatians, he talks about freedom. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. But the problem is that the American sort of very individualistic version of freedom to do whatever I want, to express whatever's inside of me, that version of freedom is not really what you're looking for. It's a false version of what I think your heart truly longs for. And so one of my favorite stories to tell to help often college students or deconstructing folks get their heads around this is from one of my favorite artists, Jim Henson. So I'm a big Muppets guy, and I'm a little outdated now with the college generation, but I tell them anyway. So Jim Henson, he has this great story in his biography of how he was creating the Muppet Show. And the Muppet Show is like a sketch comedy show with all the different Muppets. And so they're rehearsing for this show, and one of the producers is just frustrated because nothing's going right. None of the characters are right. There's Fozzie. He's got these corny jokes, but no one really understands what he's supposed to be doing there. And there's Wolf the dog, and he's got his own thing, and Miss Piggy, but nothing's really clicking. But there's this beautiful moment in biography where it's maybe 2 weeks before they have to start filming, and Jim Henson has this idea, which is to take one of his characters from his successful children's show Sesame Street, the character that most was like Jim Henson, Kermit the Frog, and put him in the middle of all those different skits.
That worked.
And yes, and everybody looks at those skits, and all of a sudden they say, well, those characters, all of a sudden, they became what they were supposed to be. But the only way they were able to become that is because Kermit was at center stage. They did not have what it took to hold it together.
Right.
And often what I tell people is, if you want freedom, Jesus has to take center stage, right? It seems paradoxical, but if you want true freedom, then Jesus, your creator, has got to be at the center of your life. That is actually, maybe counterintuitively, that is how you become your truest self, the person you were created to be.
Yeah. And again, you talk about the practice of covenant and all the rest, but in the interest of time, let me just move on to one more, and that is beauty. We've been talking about that, but nevertheless, that's a very important and sometimes neglected aspect of the Christian experience, and that's why I appreciate you putting that in the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about the arts earlier, and one of the people that I interviewed for this book is one of my favorite people, one of my good friends. His name is Kyle. And so one thing that we do as a church is we have local artists. Kyle's a very successful artist here in Indianapolis, and he's one of our elders at our church. But we do follow the seasons of the church seasons, so Christmas and the Eastertide and Advent and all that. Mm-hmm. And we have Kyle leads a group of artists who will often decorate our sanctuary in ways that are beautiful, sometimes even bizarre, but you just get the sense walking into the sanctuary that, this is a different kind of place. There are creative people here who are bringing out beauty. And one of the things that Kyle has taught me over the last few years is that creation itself is reflecting the glory of God. And that is why we pray through the seasons. When there are things growing in the spring, it is not an accident that Jesus' resurrection is like the spring, right? He talks about it like he talks about his own resurrection, like a seed that's been planted. And he talks about our own resurrected bodies that way. And so this is one of the beautiful experiences I'm able to have here, is having a collection of people who come together And really, we not only preach the gospel, but we get to see the gospel all throughout the year. And that has been such a great way for many, many people in our church to really experience restoration and renewal in a profound way.
Just before I let you go, Nicholas, let's, if we can, talk about how people can use this book. I would want to hand this to somebody who's maybe deconstructing themselves or already disillusioned or maybe already deconstructed. I might want to pass it to individuals that say, well, I'm in the church, but it just doesn't speak to all of my needs. Your goal here is to try to reach out to some of those individuals who feel disillusioned or disconnected and say there is a path back.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, just this morning, one of the most encouraging things I've heard is that someone had just read the book, and she had not been part of a church for several years. And so she read through the book and said, I put this book down. I called my manager, and I said, I need to have Sundays off so I can go to church again. And that was just music to my ears. That's what I want to hear. And the important thing for her, I think, is that this book tries to really relate to a lot of the struggles that we have, as well as invite those who are feeling disillusioned to something bigger and better. And so, this has been a book that I've seen be effective in the lives of those who are de-churched, even those who've been in the church for a long time, as you mentioned, who feel a little bit out of place. And in fact, one of the surprising things I've seen is some of the folks who have read the book have given it to their parents to help them understand them. You know, here's where I'm coming from, and to have better conversations together about, hey, could we dream together about what the future of the church could be like, and rekindling that sense of hope for us as a church and what the church can be is really something that my heart longs for, and I know it does yours as well.
Well, Nicholas, I appreciate you being with us today. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today to talk about that.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Let me just mention that we will have information on the website. I think we're having a little bit of problem with the website, but we'll get that all fixed, and you can find out more. Of course, the book is entitled The Light in Our Eyes, written by Nicholas McDonald, Rediscovering the Love, Beauty, and Freedom of Jesus in an Age of Disillusionment. As we've said before, there are all sorts of resources we would like to put in your hands. Even today, you've heard me talk about the booklets on everything from false spirituality to the next generation to imagination, and those are some of the booklets we make available to those of you that are donors as we're coming to the fiscal year end. We end our fiscal year June 30th, and now that we are in June, it's a good time for you to begin to think about what you might want to do between now and the end of this month, because that is the way in which we want to end in the black. And one of the benefits that comes to you if you join with us on our Truth Team, $1 a day, $30 a month or more, is you'll receive these booklets in the mail. But even if you have not supported this ministry, if one of those booklets are of interest to you, we'd be glad to send it to you. If you give us your email, we'll send you a PDF of it, or if you'd like to get it in the mail, give us your address, and that is a way in which we can serve you as well. We come back. We have a lot to cover, and some of that has to do with military policy. Some of it has to do with Supreme Court decisions. Stay tuned. We'll get into all of that right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, and let's get into some other issues. One of those, which I did not post on our website, is about military policy. And over these last few days, it's become more and more obvious that we probably need to pay attention to something that happened over the weekend. Military policy can sometimes change at a moment's notice based upon new technology or existing technology used in a different way. And here, as one individual described it, the story over the weekend really sounds like a Tom Clancy novel. And that is, we now know that Ukrainian intelligence agents were able to launch 117 attack drones on Sunday from trucks that had been covertly placed near Russian air bases. This level of intrigue is reminiscent of some of the things that we, of course, have talked about before with what was happening in Israel when they used those pagers and other things to blow up some of the individuals that they wanted to eliminate. Here, the same kind of, if you will, covert operation, fascinating indeed. And here's where, again, these 117 attack drones attacked what's called a spider web operation. It struck and either damaged or destroyed a third, 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carriers, destroying what many people, and again, you have to take all of this with a grain of salt because you're going to get one estimate from Russia, another estimate from Ukraine, but Ukraine claimed $7 billion of equipment that was blown up by attack drones. Now, again, according to some of the reports, these drones were smuggled deep inside Russia and hidden inside, as we mentioned just a minute ago, some of these particular trucks in then mobile log cabins. The roofs then were remotely opened up, and they launched the attacks. Now, you perhaps, if you are been out on the internet or watch television, may have seen some of those, and it has this look almost like bees coming from a hive. And so as a result, then they were able to attack these planes basically right under the nose of the Russian Domestic Security Service, which I thought was pretty intriguing indeed. And the Ukrainian official said the planes that were attacked were used by the Russian military for airstrikes on Ukrainian cities. As a matter of fact, one of these attacks was staged more than 2,600 miles from Ukraine. And so that is pretty amazing there. But it is also, as some people have pointed out, good news to the United States because many of those aircraft that were destroyed or at least significantly damaged are the long-range bombers that are nuclear weapons capable. So we're dealing with a strike that was pretty significant. Now, that's the history. What does that mean to you and me? It means some really significant things. First of all, let's just recognize, if you've listened to this program any length of time, you've heard me point out the fact that we do have Chinese interests that have come to this country and bought land. Now, buying farmland is certainly not necessarily strategically significant, except some of that land, some of that farmland is right next to important military bases. Now you can begin to think through the concerns. If indeed they were able to get drones into that farmland, they could use the same kind of attack that the Ukrainians did against the Russians, against some of our strategic bombers. And as some people have said, those staging grounds could, in some respects, maybe even make the Ukrainian attacks pale by comparison. So we're talking about something that maybe is just changing the whole nature of warfare, and there you go. Let me give you just a couple other points before we take a break. By now, of course, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it this way: by now, Americans know about Ukraine's remarkable drone strike on Sunday that damaged as many as 40 aircraft deep inside Russia as strategic bombers sat like ducks in a row on military bases. One, of course, urgent lesson, say the editors of the Wall Street Journal, is that this suggests now that the U.S. homeland is far more vulnerable than most Americans might realize. Could those have been B-2s at the hands of Iranian drones flying out of containers or flying out of containers held by the Chinese, is a question that one military analyst was asking. A very good question indeed. So the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission warned back in 2023 that the United States needs better integrated air and missile defenses against coercive attacks from Russia and China. You could also add North Korea and Iran. And, of course, you've been hearing over the last couple of days that President Trump has talked about wanting to have a Golden Dome missile defense shield. I remember when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, it was lampooned. People made fun of it. Of course, now we see how something like that has worked in Israel, and it's just a reminder that maybe we need to get a little more serious about that as well. One last comment coming, and this is sort of chilling, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Americans are accustomed to wars fought far from home by a force of volunteers, but everyone in the U.S. will be on the front lines of the next conflict, they say. Political leaders could be doing much more to educate the country about this vulnerability rather than boasting that the U.S. military is the best we've ever had. It isn't, they say. Ukraine did the U.S. a favor by destroying bombers of a U.S. adversary and also sending America a wake-up call about its own complacency. So we'll see where this takes us, but it, I think, is an illustration, again, that we are dealing with, as we've talked about in this program before, asymmetric warfare. The assumption has always been in the past that you bring force against force. And so one of the best ways for the United States to project power overseas is with our aircraft carriers and with our jets. But what if you are able to get close to an aircraft carrier and bomb it with these drones, which are difficult to pull out of the sky? You can begin to see that it's just changed the nature rather dramatically. And so whether it was running into different strategies in North Korea, certainly Vietnam, even more recently, the strategies in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we now see another issue as well. And I think it illustrates only so well that strategic ideas and strategy are oftentimes very significant, but oftentimes there is a tendency to fight the previous war instead of being prepared for the next war. And these drone strikes illustrate again that the strategic nature of some of those and the kinds of strategies and military deployment that we use maybe needs to be rethought. And I suspect there are people inside the Pentagon today that are recalibrating what that might look like in the next conflict between the United States and some other country. Let's take a break, though. Thought I'd put that on the table. It's something to think about as we get into this new age of warfare. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about social media and the teen brain. Today, I'd like to talk about social media and the impact on teenagers' mental health. An article in Axios reminds the reader that experts have been increasingly warning of a connection between heavy social media use and mental health issues in children. Apparently, there are lawsuits against social media producers that accuse them of contributing to a youth mental health crisis. Now, one of the experts quoted is Jean Twenge, who I've quoted in previous commentaries. She is a psychology professor at San Diego State University and leading expert on the subject. Here are just a few of her findings. There is a substantial link to depression, and that link tends to be stronger among girls. The amount of time spent on social media also has an effect. The more time the teen, particularly a teen girl, spends using social media, the more likely it is that she will be depressed. Jean Twenge is probably best known for her book, iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy. She describes how digital technology has shaped Generation Z, which is why she calls them iGen. Social media harms teens in 4 ways. First, social comparison. Everyone else's life looks more glamorous online. Second, displacement, because teens spend too much time online instead of with family and friends. Third, algorithms prod them towards unhealthy content. Fourth is pornography, which is reaching kids at younger ages. These recent studies should concern parents and provide them with sufficient motivation to control their family's media input, and pastors and youth leaders should also take note and warn their congregation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention our first article is entitled Intifada in America, and it comes from the editors, in this case, of the National Review. And they say, less than 2 weeks ago, we wrote about how the Intifada has come to the nation's capital when you had a young couple, an Israeli and an American, who worked for the Israeli embassy, shot and killed by a radical as they were leaving the event at the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. Of course, that was after you had already had an attack on the governor's headquarters in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro's. And of course, now we've had the desire to try to burn Jewish individuals to death there in Boulder, Colorado, through a makeshift flamethrower. And again, 8 victims in Boulder, ranging in age from 52 to 88, including one was a Holocaust survivor. And it's just a reminder that we are living in a very different world, as I mentioned just a minute ago. When we used to talk about Intifada, we talked about that in Israel. Now, some of it has come to the United States. One of the reasons I always hold up these booklets is this is a way to educate yourself. This one here actually came out in 2019, 6 years ago, but I decided to update it with this one that came out in 2023 after the attack on Israel by Hamas, because some of the arguments for anti-Semitism now have morphed into other arguments. And of course, individuals talking about free Palestine or from the river to the sea. We are certainly addressing a level of anti-Semitism and even terror action or intifada that we've never seen before. So I did want to post that one, if for no other reason. It matches very much to the conversation we had just a minute ago when we were talking about the change, if you will, in military policy and strategy based upon what has been happening with these drones and drone warfare, which, if you've seen it in Ukraine, you've got to believe that there are other countries that can do this as well. Let's face it, most of the drones used in this country were manufactured in China. If you don't see the problem with that, I just have no hope for you, but we certainly have written some Outlook magazines about the danger of China and why we should pay attention to that as well. But let's move on to some other topics because we only have so much time left. And this first article, after the one on Intifada, is about the Supreme Court. And it is entitled by the writers, by Dan McLaughlin in particular, "The Supreme Court's Big Win for Building Stuff." Now, if you have listened to the president talk about the fact we don't build stuff anymore, or going all the way back really almost 2 decades to some of the conversations we'd had, for example, with Mark Steyn, in which he was saying the same thing. We're not building anything anymore. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is we've been offshoring more and more of our manufacturing. And we've talked about how that has happened because of globalization and globalism. And elites and big companies have said, why don't we just send all of that manufacturing over here? And we don't have to even worry about environmental issues. It's cheaper because people are essentially working for slave labor and all of the rest. And so one of the reasons we don't build things is simply because we can't build things. But it's not like all the steel has gone over there, all the construction's gone over there. We still construct homes and things like that. So the other reason we don't build things is because of government regulations. And Mark Steyn, in his book, documents, I think I need to maybe dust that off again and do a commentary on the number of literally months it took to build the Empire State Building and the number of years, almost it's getting to the point now, decades, to get a high-speed rail. So you can see that something has changed. And so this court decision, as Dan McLaughlin points out, is one that is a positive if we ever want to get back to building things here in this country. And so the court, over the last couple of weeks, has already given some decisions in favor of Donald Trump. And so when you hear people complain about the Supreme Court, it just means you're going to hear about complaints about some of the federal courts, and we'll hear about that Friday with some of our guests as well. Let's just acknowledge early on that Dan McLaughlin says, look, Trump has been allowed to remove members of the National Labor Relations Board and also those on the Merit Systems Protection Board, which in some respects have been protected in the past, reinstated a Maine legislator suspended for voting for a Facebook post against males in girls' sports, upheld the power of Donald Trump to set national deportation strategy. So in some respects, you can't really say, wait a minute, finally the Supreme Court's done something that's going to be helpful for this country and the Trump administration. No, there have been some other victories along the way. And tomorrow we'll have Lathan Watts with us. We'll talk about some other victories that either have taken place or will soon, I think, soon take place. But this one is very different because it relates to environmental issues. And so the decision is in what is called 7-County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County. And as a result, it's an attempt to try to rein in some of this judicial activism. And the decision essentially clears the way so that 7 counties in the state of Utah can build a railroad against and over the objections of people who were just trying to close it down. Now, why would they want to build a new railroad line? Well, this would then facilitate the transportation of crude oil from Utah all the way to refineries in Louisiana, Texas, and elsewhere. And so what I think is so striking here is this decision came down 8-0. you've heard me say, I know I say it too often, it's hard to get a unanimous decision on anything from the Supreme Court. And the only reason it was 8-0 is because Justice Neil Gorsuch, because he actually had ruled in that region before, recused himself. So 8 out of 8 voted against the D.C. Circuit Court and against imposing additional judicial red tape on the project under what's called the National Environmental Policy Act. And so the argument being made, and this was written by Brett Kavanaugh, is that this National Environmental Policy Act is sort of a procedural cross-check, but it's not supposed to be a roadblock. And so the goal of the law, he says, is to inform the agency decision-making, not to paralyze it. And so it's a purely procedural statute, he says. And so as a result, the point he's making, and the point I'm making is it has been hard to do a lot of things because all you had to do is file another request for an environmental impact statement. You could use the NEPA or a variety of other organizations to shut down something, and it's just getting harder and harder to build things. And as a result, this, I think, is a welcome change which will allow us to be able to extract the oil and then get it to the refineries so it can get to you. One of the last couple of comments they made was this: citizens may not enlist the federal courts under the guise of judicial review of agency compliance with the NEPA to delay or block agency projects based on environmental X or other projects separate from the project at hand. And they said that what they've said is that what began as simply an attempt to provide some procedure has become now a blunt, and this is their words, blunt and haphazard tool employed by project opponents who may not be even entirely motivated by concern for the environment to stop or at least slow down new infrastructure construction projects. One of the last lines that got my attention is he said, and this is again Brett Kavanaugh, a 1970 legislative acorn has grown over the years into a judicial oak that has hindered infrastructure development under the guise of just a little more process. As a person that was around when Richard Nixon was president, I can assure you that whether it's the development of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, or the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, these were never instituted by Richard Nixon and Congress at the time, back in 1970 and later, to actually prevent us from building anything, including a railroad. It is amazing that we were able to build the entire railroad system in America, the interstate highway system, all sorts of buildings and everything, long before we had all these various government bureaucrats and government regulations which seem to be aimed at doing just one thing: preventing any kind of development, any kind of infrastructure, and kept us from, as they said, building stuff. So this is a very important Supreme Court decision. Don't think you're probably going to hear much about it on either the conservative or the liberal media. It's one that I think is going to have a great impact, but it doesn't have a lot of the entertainment value, which is why I thought it would be good for us to talk about it, because it, I think, points the way to the future in bringing America back to the America many of us used to remember. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you. Now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just as a program note mention that tomorrow we're going to have Lathan Watts in studio with Alliance Defending Freedom. And for a while, we're going to also have by phone Robert Knight. Both of them have been writing about wokeness and how, in some respects, the pushback to wokeness is really a positive. Where did it come from? Robert Knight has written about that. What's happening now in the corporate world? Well, there are some that are saying, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So I think it'll be an encouragement to you to hear from them. Then after Robert Knight goes, we'll spend some time with Lathan Watts looking at a couple of the Supreme Court decisions, either coming down, those that have come down, and kind of the state that we find ourselves in. I think it'll be just a great program indeed. Just before I get to the other two articles, one in which Ted Cruz has really expressed his concern about these activist judges, and then Philip Hamburger, who I've had on the program years ago on how to fix higher education, I thought I'd mention the two commentaries, yesterday's and today, because as your kids or your grandkids are getting out of school, if you're not careful, they're going to just pour themselves into screens, and that may not necessarily be good. Whether it's a computer screen, whether it's a screen on their phone. And so yesterday's was on social media and the brain, in which I start out with the story by Nicholas Carr, who later on wrote a book about this, but said, I get the sense that somebody was tinkering with my brain, remapping my neural circuitry, and he then, I think, illustrated only so well in his book that we have, in some respects, been engaged in a social experiment with social media. We, of course, have a lot of studies since then, and I cite one of those from the University of North Carolina, in which they were doing brain scans of middle schoolers and found that children who habitually checked their social media feeds at around age 12 showed a distinct trajectory with their sensitivity, social rewards from peers heightening over time. Not a good thing because, as we've said before, we have in our brains what's called neuroplasticity. And in a sense, you're redefining your brain. You're also redefining your reward mechanism, which can lead to addiction and those kinds of things. And so you can recognize that because of this issue of neuroplasticity, we're recognizing the danger of social media to the brains of some of your children and grandchildren. So, parent, be wise. My commentary today is entitled Social Media and Mental Health, in which I quote from an Axios, which is, again, is a website that's more left of center, but I don't care if you're a liberal or a conservative, a Republican, a Democrat, or independent. All of us should be concerned about this issue of social media. And here, experts have been increasingly warning of a connection between heavy social media use and mental health issues in children. That shouldn't be a surprise because whether it's Jonathan or first of all, let me start out with Gene Twenge or Jonathan Haidt. Either one of those individuals or both of them have been writing about this issue. Gene Twenge at the time was a professor at San Diego State University. Jonathan Haidt's been on the program. Of course, he even talked about the anxious generation. And, of course, her book was iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy. And talking about the impact that this is having on Generation Z, or even those before Generation Y. And so these are studies which I think, if nothing else, illustrate why a parent or a grandparent should pay attention to that. And a word to the wise, I think, is sufficient. Let me get on to now a couple of other issues that we might want to talk about. One of those is Senator Ted Cruz the other day was involved in a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting. This hearing was titled The Supposedly Least Dangerous Branch. That is a reference back to Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper, what was it, 78, I believe it was, off the top of my head, in which he's talking about the concern about some of these federal district judges who are instituting and bringing apart and developing and launching various injunctions against some of these actions. And he has been very critical of these judges using their positions to block many of the executive orders that came from President Donald Trump. He has called this lawfare campaign, and in some respects, it's a hearkening back to the lawfare campaign against candidate Donald Trump. Now you have a full-on lawfare campaign against President Donald Trump. He argued that these judges were confirmed by the U.S. Senate not to legislate, not to govern, but to apply the law. Makes sense? And he says, yet these federal judges have become political actors intent on hampering President Trump's agenda. Here's one of his quotes. He says, what we're witnessing is the rise of judicial lawfare from the bench. One unelected district judge sitting in a courtroom in San Francisco or Boston or Baltimore can now issue a nationwide injunction that ties the hands of the President of the United States. He concludes, Ted Cruz saying, that's not law, that's judicial tyranny. And again, he points out that you've had many of these cases which are simply not even dealt with in a back and forth manner, which you would expect in a courtroom. Okay, let me present arguments for, let me present arguments from against. And he says there's no merits review, no hearing, just judicial amnesty. He says a lawmaker brought up in Washington, D.C., the judge's ruling barring the government from requiring a proof of citizenship to vote, thus overriding election integrity laws across 50 states. Why does a judge in that area have an ability to overturn 50 state laws? Well, he or she does not. Ted Cruz brought up of a San Francisco judge ruling that required the White House to rehire all terminated federal workers and restricted future firings, effectively turning the judiciary into the HR department of the executive branch. And it then goes on to say a lawmaker also pointed out that since Trump has taken office in January, here you are, there have been over 40 universal injunctions. By the way, it's more than that, but he's just talking about the universal injunctions that have been issued against the federal government. That's just in 4 months. And 35 of those 40 came from the same 5 judicial districts. You think they're judge shopping? Of course they are. The senator then argued that in the first 150 years of the Republic, not a single nationwide injunction was issued, and that only 27 were issued in the 20th century. Under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Biden, those are 3 different presidents, which encompass 8, 8, and 4, so you can do the math, 20 years, there were just 32. And we have more than that in the first couple of months under Donald Trump's administration. Do you think there's a problem? Of course there is. One last quote from Ted Cruz. He says, and here's what makes this all the more dangerous. When a president exceeds his authority, the voters can choose a new president after 4 years. When Congress goes too far, the people can vote them out. But judges, well, judges are unelected. They serve for life. And when they impose their politics from the bench, there is no democratic check, no accountability. And so as a result, Ted Cruz asserted that we cannot allow a single district judge to wield more power than the president, Congress, and 340 million citizens combined. By ending this, we can restore the Constitution, and we need to stop letting one judge rule America. So a lot of facts and figures there. If you would want to contact your member of Congress about that, let me just mention the action item we have up at the moment is to defend parental rights in America. If you haven't already taken action, let me encourage you to do so. Click on that button that says Take Action. It will, at least supposedly, take you to that right section there, and then talk about the Families' Rights and Responsibilities Act. It was introduced by Senator Tim Scott and Senator James Langford, also introduced in the House by Representative Virginia Fox. And this is one that would certainly allow individuals who are parents to be able to exercise authority as parents. What a concept. And so if you have not taken action on that, please do so, because I'm thinking we might want to come up with some kind of action item on these activist judges. So we'll see where we go in terms of that. But this is an article that if you wanted to at least read and then maybe write a note to your elected representative or bring this piece of paper to your representative at a town hall meeting, be a good way to say, what are you going to do about this? Can we really let one federal judge, in a sense, have more power than the President of the United States? Ted Cruz is on to something, and I gave you some facts and figures, and you can find that on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that this last article is by Philip Hamburger. I always get a kick out of his name, but nevertheless, he is a professor at Columbia Law School. A brilliant individual, by the way, and I have quoted him many times because he has written this excellent book. It was published by Harvard University Press on separation of church and state, in which he gives you all the history and how we came up with this false idea that there's a separation of church and state. So he is, of course, known for many things, writing about administrative law and all sorts of things. But one of the books that we've quoted on a number of occasions is his book on separation of church and state, because it helps us understand the church-state issue without some of the bias that has come from our friends at the ACLU and the like. But this one because he is in a university, I thought was very interesting. He says, don't just fix higher education, reconstitute it. He says the real threat to the existing system comes from the internet and artificial intelligence, not Donald Trump. By the way, if you are interested, I will hold up in just a minute the latest Outlook magazine, and we do have one coming out in the future about the battle between Harvard University and Donald Trump. But everybody in the university that's a liberal thinks the problem is Donald Trump. It is not. And let's get into it. He says academic institutions think they have a problem, and its name is Donald Trump. But he's the only the beginning of their problems. The difficulties, he says, are systemic, not only legal or political. That means it's time to reconsider what higher education should look like. And so he talks about some of the ways in which, in some ways, higher education is influenced maybe too much by federal government intervention, and we can certainly acknowledge that. He says the federal government is no better at reevaluating higher education. It's focusing on the tools available to it, which would be enforcing anti-discrimination laws and defunding science, even though scientists aren't typically the culprits. And departments generally aren't the best solution for that either, because as he points out, departments, and he's seen this at Columbia, generally appoint their own faculty members so that once a department is ideologically captured, in which there's no more any ideological diversity, it just tends to tilt further in the same direction. Now, he acknowledges that part of the problem comes from government. It's often said that we're seeing the results of the left's march through the institutions. That goes all the way back to Herbert Marcuse. We've talked about that before on this program. But government policies, often based on twisted interpretations of civil rights laws, accelerated the ideological and administrative dominance. And he says it's time to really just reconsider not higher education, not only to fix it, but to reconstitute it. And he says, where in some respects the solutions are outside of the academy. Think about this. When you go to want to learn about something, maybe you go to YouTube and watch a video. Maybe now you are learning about something, even if you don't have any expertise in AI. You don't know what ChatGPT is, you still know about Google. And so you'll, in some respects, figure things out. You don't have to go, as many of us had to in the past, go to the library, find the right book on the subject, look it up. You can oftentimes have those particular pieces of information at your fingertips. Well, that's why he's saying you could have private funders could piggyback web resources and learning on existing classes in their curriculum. Here's an example. He says, imagine web pages focused on standard undergraduate reading, say a page on Pride and Prejudice, with brief video conversations between leading scholars and intellectually provoking questions to help students explore unexpected perspectives on their readings and then bring them back into the classroom. First of all, that's much cheaper than starting new universities. So his argument is that maybe we need to just think about reconstituting what we're doing in higher education. Is there going to be resistance to it? I think so. Can you imagine just saying, we don't necessarily have to have kids sitting in a classroom all 4 years at Harvard University to learn about the great books of the Western world, assuming you'd even want to teach about that in the first place, which unfortunately is not happening so much. We can do a lot of that teaching in other kinds of formats. And then he, of course, also points out that there's a problem. These universities are top-heavy. Really top-heavy. So he said what there should do is if there's going to be federal funding for higher education, it should be reduced and refined. In other words, institutions that are fattened on federal funds have expanded the number of administrators more than professors. So his suggestion is, maybe the amount of student loans and their interest rate should be inversely related to the ratio of administrators to faculty. And you can begin to see that there could be, as he's pointed out, some market forces that might cause higher education to do the right thing. And so I think those are some very important principles that he is beginning to think through. And I want to follow those over the next couple of months, because there's going to be this constant drumbeat about how the Trump administration is attacking higher education. But maybe higher education could look around and say, we're graduating students that don't seem to know a great deal. They have massive student debts. And as a result, the American people are losing their enthusiasm for higher education. If we don't find a way to reconstitute ourselves, we might find that more and more of those institutions will go to bankruptcy because students won't want to go there anymore. They'll figure out other ways to be educated. So it's something to think about, and we'll continue to talk about that here on Point of View. Earlier I did talk about the threat from China, so I thought I'd hold up. This is the July issue. It should be landing in your inbox pretty soon, and it has to do with, of course, my article on China cheating. Then we have my article on the foreign policy and the new axis of evil. Then we have a very good piece by Liberty McCarter on trade, tariffs, and Trump. And then finally one by our good friend Gary Bauer, restoring respect for America. And so we're starting to really see that some of these ideas that we're talking about need to be addressed. And one of the other arguments that I would make as to why you might want to consider joining with us. To join the Truth Team, you can join for as little as $1 a day. It's $30 a month, $360 a year. You get, of course, the Outlook magazine. You also get our booklets, and one of the ones I'm holding up right now is the one I've been mentioning, and that is the one on anti-Semitism. Of course, we'd be glad to send it to you free, so if you would like to get that booklet, we'd be glad to give it to you. But each month, we send you the Outlook magazine. Each month, we send you the booklets. Of course, there are other benefits to joining with us as well. And as we wind down the program today, I hope as we come to the end of June, I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry. I've had some individuals on this program in the past that are the head of major ministries and major organizations say that in some respects they depend very much on the gifts that come in June, because if your fiscal year ends June 30th, then as you go through the summer, you can kind of see what the next year will be like. And so in some respects, June 30th is about as important, in some respects, from a budget point of view, maybe even as important or more important than December 31st. So consider what you might do to support this ministry, especially as we enter into these summer months. But that's all we have for today. Let me first of all say thank you to Megan for all the work she does behind the scenes, engineering the program. And Karen, thank you for all the work you've been doing today, trying to get everything up on the website and producing the program. We're looking forward to tomorrow. Lathan Watts, Robert Knight, and others. So we'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.